Okay, so we're going to do a whistle-stop tour of the literary sources. I'll try and do it in about 45 minutes, and I'll try and distill it down to the absolute key points that I think that you need, okay? So just to remind you, we've got to do the Aeneid, and it's book 6, and it's book 8, and also you're doing Horace, 2 poems, the Carmen Saeculare and the Ode 1.12. What I've done in the sheets that you have there is I've distilled what I think are the absolutely key points that we're going to go through today. And as I go through, I'll link it to the prescribed sources, and I'll link to important laws and historical events, and of course I'll link it to the visual material as well. So if we begin with the Carmen Saeculare, it's a really good poem to be able to quote from, because it's a fantastic piece of propaganda. Don't forget that it's Horace, and Horace himself was dispossessed, do you remember, by the prescriptions of the land seizures? So it kind of shows the incredible transition from the early nasty Octavian, who we read about, and Suetonius, who gouges eyes out and who threatens senators, etc., and Horace being a kind of victim of that kind of violence and aggression, to being a kind of propagandist for him. Let's not forget as well, the Ludi Saeculare, which you might get asked about, is absolutely key for a whole variety of reasons. These secular games, well, first of all, if you get a question on religion, these secular games had sort of died out, hadn't they? They hadn't been, in operation for a long time. He revives them. So we'd want to link then to Res Gestae, to the revival of various festivals, like the Lubricania, to the revival of the temples, to the whole cult of going back to the ways of the ancients. And then, of course, you could cross-reference to Res Gestae, because that's the way he wants to present himself all of the time, as a preserver and not an innovator, okay? We can also link Carmen Saeculare beautifully, in particular, to the Ara Pacis. So I'll go through now how we're going to do that. O gentle Alethea, duly revealing the child at full term, now protect gentle mothers, whether you be rather known as Lucina or Gentalis. These are different names for the same goddess, isn't it? Okay. And who is the goddess? This is the goddess of childbirth. Okay. So why is that so important? Well, Paterculus tells us that Augustus, the reason why he's so revered and so loved after Actium, is that he brings back fertility, and he brings back kind of hope and prosperity to Rome. Now we know in the Ara Pacis that we have genitalis in the Ara Pacis itself, don't we? We have this kind of mother. We have all of those images of this family. We know that in spite of the irony of the fact that Augustus doesn't really have children himself other than Julia, he kind of hires Agrippa's children, doesn't he? And he constantly is trying to pose with children and to put himself up as a kind of pater patriae. I think he takes that literally, doesn't he? So this idea of him bringing fertility and fecundity, it really also links to the Rex Julia. Now, we were talking about those a moment ago. Now, they fall into 2 main categories. The first being the adultery laws, and you'll recall those. Those are the harsh, punitive ones, aren't they, against adultery. And they show Augustus's readiness to intervene in matters of private morality, don't they? Now, if we're looking for evidence of state overreach and of a kind of coerciveness, then we could look no further than the Rex Julia. On the other side, the less punitive laws are the ones concerning childbirth. And in particular, you will remember that senators are compelled to get married, aren't they? People are incentivized to have children, and conversely, they are penalized for not doing so. Kind of ironic that he himself would have fallen foul of them. But if we go with this idea of what does this represent, it represents the idea that we have a kind of new Rome, a Rome that is vastly going to increase in terms of population. What would we point to? We would point to the figures given to us in the Res Gestae. Do you remember? The different census and the fact that the citizens of Rome increased by almost 1 million. And that is seen as absolutely so key to the way in which he wishes to portray himself as a kind of grower and nurturer of the nation. And in the Carmen Saeculare, it goes on to say, Goddess, nurture our offspring, bring to fruition the Senate's decrees concerning wedlock. And of course, you know what I'm going to say. The Senate's decrees concerning wedlock. Does that not sound, guys, like the Res Gestae, where the Senate decreed, etc.? Now, we actually know, don't we, that the Rex Julia were unpopular laws, were they not? And we know that both equestrians and senators protested them. And we know that it was one of Augustus's few failures, and that in the end, although they weren't entirely, erased, people were not complying with them, which is kind of interesting. So what do we see from Horace? We see from Horace that he is cooperating with Augustus's ruse, the idea that these laws came from the Senate. O woman who'll bear us more our children, the laws of marriage. Well, what a sycophant. So how about, that would be a nice segue into Tacitus, wouldn't it? Don't you think? Remember, Tacitus tells us that the historians had become sycophants. Now, Horace, in this case, is not a historian. But nevertheless, we see that the writers of the day almost directly engaging in propaganda, don't you think? The poetry becoming a way of pushing and trying to validate the legislation. So it shows that the literature must have been considered very important in terms of changing people's minds, shaping people's consciousness, and behind it all, who do we see? We see the shadowy figure of Maecenas, don't we? Who we sort of described, didn't we, as a kind of shadowy minister of culture, who at an early stage understood the importance of statutory, of architecture, and of literature, all working together to legitimate and to propagate the vision of the Principate. So it's really important. So just that short bit of the Carmen Saeculare is really, you can say a great deal about that, even if you're only using a paragraph. I'm now going to move on. Whatever a noble descendant of Venus and Anchises asks with a white steer's sacrifice, let him obtain, a winner in war, merciful to our fallen foe. Even in this short bit, I can say a lot, So the Carmen Saeculare itself was this spectacular visual thing, wasn't it? Do you recall that Augustus does a lot of the slaughtering and the sacrifices himself, doesn't he? Do you recall that you have these 99 male and female virgins singing, etc.? So it is really important, if you get a question on religion, to talk about the Carmen Saeculare. And you could write at least one really big paragraph just on this bit, couldn't you? On how the religion, we know that he would have appeared hooded, that he was with Agrippa. We can link to the Ara Pacis, can't we? We could talk to this incredible visual spectacle that would have overawed people. Do you remember the amounts of sacrifices, the bulls, the cows, the elaboration of it all? And that, of course, is going to link to the story of the Aeneid. In this case, I believe it's Silverus. Remember that? And the slaughtering of the white stag that occurs in the Aeneid. So what you see in this whole literary endeavor, in this literary project, is this intertextuality, don't you? You notice that the poems will refer to events at the time, they'll refer to laws, they'll go back in time, and they will establish this long sense of continuity. Do you recall that the secular games can also be called the Trojan games? And one of the things that Augustus pushes is he really has this kind of mythical relationship to Troy as being a huge part of his story. Why does he do that? Because it allows this kind of divine narrative, doesn't it? Who is his relative? The goddess Venus of the Julia clan. Do you remember the Julian clan? So we could link this to the fact that at an early stage he understands the value of using religious references and giving him a kind of supernatural status. And that, of course, could take us back to Diva Filius, couldn't it? And the comet. And the idea at an extraordinary young age, he actually seemed to understand the value of these symbols as propaganda. You spoke about the coins earlier. We could think of the denarius that has the comet in, couldn't we? And the use of the Diva Filius, etc. here. And again, Horace is doing a wonderful propaganda job for him, isn't he? At the same time as well, we know that Suetonius tells us that the early Augustus was very bloodthirsty, wasn't he? He's a kind of enfant terrible, isn't he? You remember all of the things that he does? He has people go into the Senate with daggers, Cornelius, etc. The ripping out of eyes, isn't there? There's the decapitation of Brutus, isn't there, etc. There's the violence of the prescriptions. But by now, this is what fits in with the religious bit. Even though he's a winner in war, he is always seen as merciful to the fallen foe, which is really interesting. That clementia that at first he almost criticizes in his adopted father Julius Caesar, now it's part of his kind of persona, isn't it? And that will be very important in the Aeneid. And now we come to the Parthians, yeah? Now we know from Res Gestae that he's very, very proud of getting the standards back from the Parthians. And there seems to be all sorts of reasons for that, don't there? Parthians are one of the few, or perhaps the only, real civilization empire that defeat the Romans on a number of occasions. And of course, most notably, there's the death of Crassus, where some of the standards are lost. But you will recall also Mark Antony loses standards as well, doesn't he? So by having the standards returned, that is a fantastic contrast with the loss of the standards with Mark Antony. We know that Antony never really gets named anymore, but to most Romans, they don't need to name him. His fall from grace is so kind of notorious. And so we've got the sharp contrast here. Now, what would we want to link to here? We'd want to link to the prima porta, wouldn't we? And to the breastplate in particular, wouldn't we? Where we have the Parthians sort of kneeling, do you remember? Giving the standards back. Why that is such an important moment is that it's reframed from being a diplomatic victory into a military victory, isn't it? Okay. And if we think in terms of the frontiers, because Finley was talking about that a minute ago, it's very important because one of the most dangerous frontiers is, of course, that Parthian frontier. But by this stage now, Augustus is spinning it so that he's making the empire safe, isn't he? And if you remember, he basically has a combination of client kings, do you remember this? And buffer zones. And the buffers work in different ways. He may have Roman veterans stationed there, or he might have kings that are very favorable to him, offering a buffer zone so that they're not on the doorstep. So it shows the importance, doesn't it, that Augustine believes in securing the borders. And that would lead nicely into a discussion about the Pax Romana or the Augustan or the Pax Augusta, if you're talking about the frontiers policy. Now notice this. This is written a long time before Res Gestae, but it's almost like Res Gestae are going to take lines from it. Look at this. The Parthians fear our forces. They fear the Albanaxes. They're always going back to older references for Rome. Remember, the precursor to Rome is Alba Longa. Remember that? And so it's part of this huge project that Augustus engages in of reacquainting the Romans with their rich history and reattaching present-day Rome to this early kind of embryonic Rome that he really kind of glorifies, doesn't he? Okay? Once proud Indians. Well, what's really interesting, guys, is at the moment William Dalrymple has just written a book that shows that he reckons at least a third of Roman trade was with India. So this is something you could really put in your exam. This is a new unexplored area that at the time, Rome was really trading with India through Egypt, okay? And we're talking about spices and gold and incense and all those kind of things now, okay? So they knew about the Indian civilization and empire, but here, of course, Rome has been represented as, beating them. In reality, they were a trading partner. And then the Scythians are also referred to. They beg for an answer. So there's this new sense in Augustan Rome that everyone is bowing down to them, isn't there? And this is part of this new imperial consciousness that we spoke about. So in that one poem, I think you can actually do a lot. And when you're discussing the poem, it would be best if you can refer to historical events and to the visual media. Now I'm just going to do a little bit more before I stop this section of the video. Okay, and now we're moving on to Ode 1.12. Again, it's Horace, okay? And I'm only going to do the last 4 stanzas of the poem. Marcellus's fame, its upgrowing head. Well, I'm going to start off by just saying it's extraordinary that Marcellus is written about as much as he is, isn't it? And that does show, doesn't it, problems of the succession. It's like a wound, isn't it, for them? Because they go back to Marcellus so much. Of course, in the Aeneid, he gets a huge part, doesn't he, of Book 6, when they go to the underworld, where he is, given this wonderful description of this man who was never defeated. He was the sort of anointed prince that was taken from them too early, etc. And we know that Octavia is supposed to have passed out and fainted when that was read to her. So it does show just the depth of pain of losing him, okay? It says, springs like a tree, great Julius's light. Of course, that refers to the comet, doesn't it, okay? Shines like the radiant moon amid the lamps of night. And so here we have our Diva Filius thing, don't we? It's so important, isn't it? And it's so important in terms of securing the young Octavian's kind of legitimacy. Dread sire and guardian of man's race. He's talking to Jove now, isn't he? To thee, O Jove, the fates assign our Caesar's charge, okay? His power and place next to thine. Now that's extraordinary, isn't it? It's almost like that Augustus is like a kind of earthly Jove, isn't it? There's a mirroring between the two of them, isn't there? So we know in terms of the religious symbolism and representation that Augustus likes to associate himself with quite a number of gods, with Venus through the Julia, with Apollo, the Temple of Apollo being so important in the Forum, and the Temple of Apollo being very close to his palace on the Palatine Hill, and the fact that in the 30s he dressed as Apollo, didn't he, and wanted to be seen as the counterpoint to Mark Antony's Dionysus. And Apollo, of course, is music, harmony, reason, and light. Now, this is very important because in all the literature, that's what he's associated with. And when we look at Book 8 of the Aeneid, of course, Mark Antony is discord, wine, sexuality, vice, and irrationality, isn't it? Yeah? And it just shows how that propaganda worked and how they used archetypes. Then we go back to the Parthians, do you see? Whether the Parthians threatening Rome, his eagles scattered to the wind. So what's that a reference to again? Again, back to the eagles. It just shows how important that is in the Roman consciousness. Or follow to their eastern home, Cathay and Ind. another sort of reference to the East, etc. You could argue that, in a sense, it is kind of diminishing those far Eastern empires and raising the glory of Rome to show how much greater it is than the East, yeah? And then he says, thy second, let him rule below. That's interesting, isn't it? So it is like he's a demigod, isn't he? And if we were to speak anachronistically, if we were in medieval times or studying Macbeth or something, this would be divine right, wouldn't it? This would be the fact that Jove has appointed him. Now, this is all really what we would associate with monarchy, isn't it, guys? So if you were doing an essay on Augustus was a monarch, well, it would be very interesting to refer to the literature, wouldn't it? And to say, certainly in terms of the literature, we have many of the features that we would understand as monarchy, don't we? Divine right, being appointed, legitimacy, lineage, this very long line of legitimacy, etc. And then he says, thy car, thy vehicle, shall shake the realms above. And that's obviously, Jove with his thunderbolts. Thy vengeful bolts shall overthrow each guilty grove. It's kind of quite threatening the way that it ends, isn't it? Almost as though, again, that there will be a divine punishment to anyone who dares to revolt against the kind of divinely appointed princeps. And if we think about it now in terms of chronology, this poem is written after the adjustment to the second constitutional amendment, isn't it? Sometimes called the third constitutional amendment. And by this stage now, Augustus's power has been secured, hasn't it? He no longer needs to act as consul. Now he's the kind of more or less permanent consul. He has the consul insignia. He sits between the consuls, isn't he? He is he's the princeps and senatus, isn't he? He has the imperator. He has the general. He doesn't yet have the pater patriae, but he has the power of the censor. He has all of the religious titles, doesn't he? And what is his most important power of all that he uses? The tribune power, which he's now established, isn't it? Yeah. So I'll stop that one there and then do another one.